afternoon even. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm just going to pause slightly or just do a little bit of webinar small talk to make sure everyone who wants to join has joined. Thank you all for joining us virtually. Thank you very much to James and Louise, our wonderful panelists. Thanks to Kiri and colleagues from the PRCA for making this happen and answering all my questions and panics and whatnot. We've got a good session ahead. So yeah, I'm Sam Byrne-James. I'm a member of the PRCA Charity Not-For-Profit Group committee. One of the privileges of being on that committee is I get to speak to and grill and pick the brains of interesting people, and of course, as attendees, you should also do the same. You've got the chat and the Q&A on this webinar. Just so you're aware, if you use the chat, then that can be seen by everyone. If you use the Q&A, it just comes to us. If when you post questions, you might be nice if people can mention the organisation they're from or a bit about the sector that they're working in, just so that we can kind of tailor our answers or kind of understand your context. So yes, I'll carry on with this, delaying to allow everyone to join for a little longer, just by recapping what this event's about. So from Black History Month, World Mental Health Day and International Women's Day, through to International Hummus Day, National Pizza Month, and many more beyond, there are awareness days, weeks and months, for practically everything. But how useful are they? Is awareness still a useful concept for them? Is it best to create your own or piggyback on existing moments in the calendar? And how can you make sure they remain fresh and offer something new each year? So I'm going to introduce our two speakers, but first must apologise that the Money and Pensions Service, who were advertised as panellists, have said they aren't able to join. And as we understand, this is because they are a public body. They're accountable to the Department for Work and Pensions. And this is their interpretation of restrictions put on the organisation during this time of national mourning, which is, of course, frustrating, but understandable. They want to err on the side of respect and of caution. When we do an event write-up, we'll go on the PRCA website. I'll try to share some resources or some information because clearly the area they're working in is incredibly relevant at this time. So yes, I will hand over now to our first speaker. And as Kiri from PRCA is reminding us on chat, do get your questions in via the chat or the Q&A button. So Louise is our first panelist. Good afternoon, Louise.
Hi everyone. Hi, I'm just going to share my screen with you so that we can just run through some slides. So my name is Louise Akers. I'm an associate member at the Campaign Collective. I've been working with the collective for the last 5 years. And before that, I worked in-house for a number of charities, NHS trusts, universities, on various causes. So focusing on health, disabilities, international development, so a real variety of things. And I'm just going to talk through my experiences of working on national or international awareness days, weeks and months, and just see if some of my experience can give you some helpful advice for anything that you're planning. So I'm going to look at two areas. One of them is taking part in existing days and another is creating your own. So I've got experience of doing both. I've just listed here a few things to consider from the start. I'm sure a lot of you already do this generally with your PR planning, but it's really good to just like take a moment and think about how will being involved or creating an event enhance the reputation of your organisation. So is it a good thing for you to do in the first place? Is it going to reach your stakeholders? Is it going to raise your profile in a positive way? And do you want to get involved in an existing day, or do you want to create your own? Or again, you could possibly do both. So there are pros and cons to each approach. If you're going to get involved in an existing day, you're already likely to have quite an engaged audience out there. There'll be hashtags you can get involved with on social media. There'll potentially be stories that you could quote on that are going out in the news media. But the con of it is you're likely to be competing for media space with loads of other organisations, so you might get lost in the noise. So it's just something for you to have a little think about, and whether your cause actually could be a standalone event on its own. It's also worth at this stage just having a particular think about your aims and objectives. Like, what do you really want to achieve? Is it just raising the profile of your organisation, or do you have any key actions you want from people, or is there anything particular? Do you have fundraising aims, everything like that? And do you have a budget as well? Because it could be that you do something big like an event or a stunt, a PR stunt, or it might be that you're focusing on digital activity. So I'm just going to talk a little bit here about what it's like to be involved in existing events. So in last May, I worked for Melanoma Focus, a charity, on Skin Cancer Awareness Month, which takes place each year in May. The charity hadn't really had much media coverage before for this month, so they really wanted to be a part of it. So I started working with them back in sort of January, February time, and we came up with the idea of creating our own news stories for the month. And this was based on a public survey. So we ran the survey, we created 3 strong news stories based on prevention, symptoms and sunbed use, and we ran this throughout the month. And it was just a really good way of creating a unique hook, so we could break through the noise of anything else happening throughout the month. We also had a bank of case studies and spokespeople that were available. We got those all lined up in advance, and we created regional and country specific stories as well. And we ended up with really good coverage for this. We had a reach of around 70 million. So it was really positive. It was a really great sort of first month of activity for the charity. So the campaign was designed to work in partnership with the public affairs activity. So we had an event at Parliament. We created a hashtag that was used across social media. The banners you can see here, they were created into posters that were at motorway service stations for people that might be going on holidays. And MPs were invited along to the event. They had their photo taken, and they were all given a template press release for them to send to their constituencies as well. So we ended up getting really good regional coverage from that. So that was another strand, another way to link in with all the national coverage as well. So that was an example of an existing month. Another example, so this is an example of creating your own day, week or month. And this was for a charity, the Less Survivable Cancers Task Force, who I've been working with for the last 3 years. They're a coalition of 6 charities. So these are charities that work they're cancer charities that work with people who are diagnosed with less survivable cancers. So if you're diagnosed with one of these cancers, your life chances are much lower than others. So it's things like pancreatic, lung, liver, stomach, esophageal and brain cancer. So we do work on World Cancer Day in February, and we do normally get coverage, but we decided actually this is something that affects a huge number of people, and it actually warranted its own standalone day. So last January we decided to launch our own day, and we had to create a unique news hook for this. So we decided to look at NHS data about where people were getting diagnosed, and we found that the majority of people with these cancers were diagnosed in A&E. And so we came up with the hashtag diagnosed too late, because once they were diagnosed, there were no treatment options for them because it was far too late in their disease. We used the Close the Deadly Cancer Gap slogan that we've been using for the charity for the last couple of years. And we created a story based on that NHS research. So we created a really strong story about the diagnosis and chances for people. Again, it worked really well. It was really positive for the first time we'd done it. This is just an example of some of the coverage. We used case studies again. We ended up on the front page of the Herald in Scotland, which was really useful. And we tied it very much in with social media activity, and something that was quite positive was because there were 6 charities involved, we could link it, we could spread the news to all the followers of those charities, and we got, you know, a lot of visits to the website on the back of it. And a real key aim of this was to raise awareness of the symptoms, so we made sure those messages were weaved into the press releases and to all the social media assets as well. We also tied in with political engagement. So we wrote to MPs, we asked them to support our activity. And we had statements of support from 115 politicians, and we had videos as well, including from Humza Yousaf and Jeremy Hunt, which was really good. And we had really good social media support from MPs as well. So that was an example of creating a whole new day from scratch. It does take a lot more work, a lot more build up, but it was really worth doing in the long run. And this is just an example of working on an existing global day. So this is another one of my clients, the International Menopause Society. So they created World Menopause Day 10 years before we started working with them. We've been working with them for the last 3 years to try and create, you know, more coverage for them, and it's been really interesting to work on this because it's global. So we work with teams all over the world to make sure that their messages are tailored. It's based on all their days are based on a white paper that they release each year, and so it's very science research based. It's written by the clinicians involved in the charity, and it's a really interesting area. We get loads of engagement on social media because it's a focus that, you know, we're getting a lot more people engaged in the topics, so it's really, really positive. Yeah, and it's just an example of how it can work on a global scale as well, and that's something for you to consider when you're thinking about whether to have awareness days. Is, are you going to do it countrywide, or are you going to think about it as actually a global thing, and do you want to work with other people on that as well? So that's just a little bit of a summary about my experience and sort of a few key learnings from that. I've put it together in a slide as a bit of a checklist. I know a lot of you have been working in PR for a while, so you'll know this. It's sort of the normal rules of PR apply. You need to come up with something newsworthy. So the fact that it's an awareness day isn't enough for a journalist to take interest. You need to come up with something unique, something that they're going to want to write about. So it might be a new piece of research or a new report highlighting something, or a new call that the charity is making or the organization is making. So something newsy. If you're creating your own day, check that nothing similar already exists. If it does, you might want to collaborate with that organization, or you might consider working with other organizations anyway. So the Less Survivable Cancers Task Force, we had 6 charities involved, so that really helped. We could all share each other's, you know, social media. We could share work on social media. We were all really behind it together, so that was really good. Consider your audiences and the scope. So as I mentioned, do you want to do it countrywide, or do you think it's strong enough to be a global issue? If it's global, just a little bit of advice, PR advice, is to really think about time zones and embargoes, and how you're going to work that, how it works practically, how you're going to communicate with all the teams you're working with. Plan well in advance. Think about any long lead media opportunities. Case studies are really, really important for these days. So if you can line up some features in advance, that's great. And as I said, yeah, develop a bank of case studies and spokespeople, and think about whether they need media training beforehand as well. Have several strands for the campaigns, because especially if you're working on something like World Cancer Day, if you're a cancer charity, for example, there's going to be so much going out there. You need to not just rely on media coverage. You need to think about social media, public affairs, and also think about if you're doing fundraising, for example, you might want to have a fundraising target that the day's focused around, and you could include links to the fundraising donation page on your press releases, on your social media. So just consider that. What can you get? How can you make the most out of that day? Just consider that from the beginning as well. And yeah, be flexible in the news agenda and react to your engagement. So if you see that, you know, someone might comment on what you've done, it might be negative, you need to respond to that. So make sure people are available on the day. You've got, you know, your PR teams there, your spokespeople are available. You might want to do letters to editors if there's something else you see out there. So again, normal rules of PR are applying there. And then I just put evaluate and use the learnings for next year, because I think if it goes well, you could definitely start, you could reuse some of the hashtags, you could link back to the stories, you could build on a story you've used last year, go back to journalists that were keen. So really like make the most of the first time you do it and build on it. If it wasn't as successful as you thought, have a think about why, look back on that and see what you could possibly change if you did it again. Okay, so that's just a quick summary from me, and I will hand you back to Sam.
Well, Louise, thank you. And one thing, well, lots of really useful points there. One thing that jumped out is, yes, going to motorway service stations, which I love that kind of, you know, creative and, you know, different environment. Did you spend the day in a motorway service station then?
No, it was posters. So we had posters in the service stations because we thought that was where people would be likely to be going on holiday, and it was skin cancer awareness. So we wanted to encourage them to think about that. And next year we're already trying to arrange to do that in airports as well. So to have the posters to set up so that people will see it.
We'll keep an eye out when we're on our off on our holidays. But yeah, really just a really kind of interesting new creative way of just thinking about who you need to reach and what you need to take them. A reminder to everyone, do ask questions in the Q&A or in the chat. And yeah, I will hand over now to James.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you very much, Louise, for that fantastic introductory session. And thank you all for joining. My name is James McCollum. I'm a director at Barley Communications. Barley's a social purpose communications agency. It was founded in 2016. I've been there the last 4 years. Before that, I was at a global PR firm for about 8 years, running public and third sector communications campaigns. And that included a lot of awareness days, weeks, months as well. So I will try and share my slides if that's okay. And I will assume that if I don't share them correctly, that one of the team will shout at me and tell me so. Can everyone see those? Great, excellent. So just a bit more background. I think Louise is quite right. There are different types of activity when it comes to awareness days, weeks and months. It goes from running organisations' own days, which we've done a lot of here at Barley, from World Obesity Day, Purple Tuesday, I know was mentioned in some of the introductory copy as well. We've also launched some of our own, which we've done for an ocean conservation organisation. And we've also done what I'm sure everyone on this call has done, which is the sort of tokenistic posts or nods that our bosses or CEOs or trustees or board members might ask us to do to tack onto certain things. So the way I've tried to approach this is trying to think about the questions we need to ask ourselves from scratch when we're asked to do any of those kinds of things at any level. What do we need to do to make it a success, even if it is just a tokenistic post as well? So if we move on to the first place that I always start, and people who've worked with me say I'm really boring because all I ever do is talk about objectives, but it genuinely is the most important thing. What is it that you're looking for, or what have we been asked to look for by said CEO, manager, trustee, or whatever? What does success look like? Because if you haven't answered that, then you're not going to be able to evaluate the success, which Louise has just talked about in the presentation there. So you need to ask yourself or your client or your boss the fundamental questions. Is this a key strategic priority? Is it just a content filler? Or is it actually looking more like we're jumping on a bandwagon? And I think you need to ask yourself those questions because there's so many awareness events out there. So I'm sure if you were to look at it and find a way, someone would find a way to get involved with one every single day of the year. But you really need to try and distill that and work out what's important for us. So those are the three sort of key things I'd bear in mind. Is it our strategic priority? Is it a filler? Or actually, is it a bit bandwagon? And if in doubt, should we stop it? So I was thinking about this and I thought back to the sort of key principles that I think are the most important things when we're considering what to do around awareness days, weeks or months. The first is relevance in terms of the topic or the theme. As we know, awareness days, weeks and months usually I think have themes. How relevant is it to our organization or our clients and what we're being asked to do? What would be the impact? A, awareness, but B, more than that. What's the end impact of what we'd be doing? Tactical delivery, which of course lots of sensitivities around that, and I'm sure there's lots of examples that people have seen where they've questioned some of the tactical delivery, and also the tone as well. So I think those are the 4 key principles that please do bear in mind every time you're asked to look at something around awareness. So let's do a deeper dive into these slightly, looking at relevance first. I mentioned issue and theme. So there might be an awareness day one year that's been relevant for your organization, but that's because their theme that year might have been relevant for your organization. It doesn't mean it's going to work again the next year, despite what the CEO of your organization might say, or other senior people in the organization might say. You know, we did this one year, why don't we do it the next? If the theme has changed and the topic's not relevant, you've got to seriously ask yourself whether it's something you want to do again. Looking at the audience is naturally super important. Who is the audience? There's audiences within your organization, there's audiences without your organization, there's audiences in terms of other organizations getting involved. So you need to have a real think about, in terms of your own communications plan, your own strategic plan for the organization, how relevant is this for your key strategic audiences? Have a think about the landscape. Landscape's important because, as Louise said, there's a lot of noise around awareness days and weeks and months. Lots of other organizations will have a look at their calendars, see this and think, oh, we can jump on that. We want to do something about that. So who else is involved? Who are you up against, essentially? Whose story is going to be up against yours, where maybe if you're selling into media, they might be getting 20 press releases about this awareness day or something on that day. So who are you up against, and how can you cut through the noise, and which tactics therefore do you think you should deploy? And then finally, do some groundwork. Look at the history. What's happened in the past? I think if you look at the history of awareness days, it's really, really interesting in terms of seeing how they've developed over the years. But certainly look at the past few years of a specific one you've been asked to do, because likelihood is something that someone tells you they think we should do has already been done before. So do have a look and have a think, because you don't want to repeat any missteps that might have been done. So impact. We're big on impact at Barley. It's our biggest success measure, really. We've got our own sort of model of impact and what that sets out to achieve. The first question I'd ask is, why is there an awareness day, week or month for this? Go back to absolute basics. What will awareness achieve? What's it going to do? And who is it going to do it for? So you need to have a think about who those beneficiaries are, who's really interested in this, that's going to benefit from awareness, and how will your activity help? Are you just adding to the noise needlessly, or are you genuinely going to be able to help, whether that's through fundraising to support vital medical research, whether that's through providing an important conversation or topic that people, maybe people who live with certain conditions, feel much more comfortable talking about. If your activity can help, then you're along the right lines. If you're asking yourself that question, how your activity will help, and you can't answer it well, then there's a bit of doubt in terms of what you're going to be able to achieve, and some of the kind of fallout that you might get from what you're doing. As a bit of background, and I'd urge anyone who is actively involved in planning for awareness days, weeks and months to read it. There was a book published in 2017 by Mylea Hill and Marceline Thompson-Hayes called The Awareness Myth. And it really is looking at a specific focus on public health campaigns. And they argue that using awareness as the ultimate goal or the ultimate impact measure in public health campaigns is misguided. It does more harm than good. Because quite often that awareness culture simply leads to an ever-increasing cycle of awareness without change, without behavior change, or without sustained participation and support for certain causes. So go beyond that awareness myth. What can we change? How can we lead to active participation or behavior change that can help alleviate the problems that at the end of the day these awareness days, weeks and months originally set out to do? And I'd really, really encourage everyone to keep that as the golden thread and the heart of everything that you're planning. Moving on to tactics, everyone on this call has delivered loads of PR campaigns and tactical activation, so I won't be here too long. But one thing I did want to highlight is how many tactics there are available to us to support some of this activity, particularly the ones where we're asked to do something we don't feel we can go big on it. We might be able to do something tokenistic, like I said earlier, and we might be able to get away with it. Then you don't want to look at media relations, because I think everyone on here knows there's a level of cynicism among some of the journalists and key nationals around awareness days, weeks and months. And so I'd encourage everyone to think beyond the realms of certainly media relations, and do think about some of the other basics that the client or the organization that you're working for could be doing. For instance, I'd particularly call out things like website and SEO. If they really want to get something about that awareness day week or month and their organisation around that time, that's going to be the one day of the year most people are going to be Googling that awareness day, week or month. So what's the website saying about it? What will people find when they search it? And what can you do to make sure that they find your organization's activity? So there's lots of different ways that you can make sure that your organization is supporting certain awareness days, weeks and months without it necessarily being that difficult call to a journalist that you know is just going to be maybe a bit wound up because they've received so many on that day. The other one I want to talk in terms of tactics, and hear me out here, because you might think, what's he on about, is timing. So if there's an awareness day, you know that there's going to be a massive concentration of activity on that day. And surely, naturally, that's the day you're going to go out. But as Louise rightly said, it's a busy environment on that day for a lot of those awareness days, weeks and months. So how are you going to cut through the noise? One way you might want to do it, particularly if you're a David against a Goliath, and it's someone else's awareness day, maybe the UN is running it, but you see for that particular theme, your organization is a massive leader, massively wants to do it. Why wait for the day? Why don't you trail it earlier? If you go too early or you go at the wrong time, you're just going to end up not getting through the door. You won't get past first base and you'll look a bit of an idiot and fall flat on your face. But if you can get, I don't know, a weekend trail in a Sunday, for instance, before the awareness week starts, you can beat the big guns, get out there before it and really get your organization at the forefront of the agenda of that week, for instance, before it's even started. And then, wow, you've got some big results. You can help set the agenda and you can support the commentary on social media throughout the week in a really, really effective way. So do think about timing. Don't just constrain yourself to that specific day, week or month. Final principle is tone. I think this is a super important one. And I would say, actually, they're all important. I'm not going to try and rank all the different principles. But for me, tone is absolutely critical because you get all the other three right. And then if you screw up the tone, you're in big, big trouble. I think what we always need to remember is we've got to be sensitive. I think most awareness days, weeks or months involve an end person, individual, group, user who's been affected in some way or is very, very passionate about a certain interest in some way. Some may be vulnerable, some may feel stigmatized, some may feel empowered. There's lots of different feelings and emotions going on, and I think we need to be, as the communications professionals, cognizant of that. Who are the audiences out there that are going to be looking at this? I think there are some really, really interesting examples in the past where organizations have got this wrong. I think the biggest recently I remember was Burger King on International Women's Day and going out on Twitter saying women belong in the kitchen, and then using a Twitter thread to try and explain, you know, that was their way to get the interest, and then they were using the Twitter thread to explain the rest of it, and it just did not land at all. And I think the tone and being sensitive but also compelling and appropriate is super, super important here. And the best way to do this really is exactly as Louise described: case studies. Use the lived experience to support your work, particularly when it comes to health campaigns. I think it's so, so important. But also, it doesn't just have to be case studies in the activation. You can also look at getting lived experience involved much earlier in the process. Test the messaging, test the campaign creative, and really, really get them involved from the outset. So those are my that's just my 2 pence on some of the key things to think about, some of the key principles to avoid scoring any own goals. Just in closing remarks, I've really focused here on awareness moments where you might want to go big, but you might also have to answer questions about what can we do just to do something. So I've tried to just cover off some of the questions to ask that applies to all of those. But yeah, very happy to take questions on more specifics. And I will now stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you, James, very much. And I mean, yes, that Burger King example on International Women's Day you mentioned was horrific, and I, you know, we should all, as PRs, probably be a bit reticent to be too critical of other people's work, because they're for the grace of God go I. But I think that is one that deserves a place probably in the write-up as just you know, you need to think these things through. A couple of people have asked in the Q&A or in the chat about whether slides will be available and whether the recording will be available. Yeah, we'll do a write-up, post this this recording on the PRCA website. That'll go out next week, and that should be emailed to everyone. There's also someone who has asked James, could you share that piece of research on negative impact of awareness campaigns? And I think that was, well, you mentioned the book, The Awareness Myth, which I just Googled. So Marceline Thompson Hayes and Mylea D. Hill, if I've got that right. Was there a particular, and again, I'll make sure I get that name in the write-up. Was there a particular bit of research, or was it just the book as a whole you were referring to?
I was referring to the book as a whole. I think in terms of the research, it's not, I don't think there's any, there might be some other bits that led to the creation of that book, but certainly that book is the one that certainly piqued interest in it in terms of public health campaigns and just, you know, what is the end goal? Let's get back to thinking what the final impact is here. So yeah, fully recommend it.
So I think then in terms of research, that leads into the question of evaluation, and something Lorraine has mentioned in the chat is, you know, the answer to the question about what the, you know, when you say, what is the purpose of running an awareness day or getting involved in someone's day? And if the answer is to generate awareness, well, that's not a smart objective, that's quite a sort of a woolly, loose objective. Obviously, one way to try and I don't know if this would be turning into a smart objective, would be to run, you know, public polling to, you know, to try and see if your messages have got through. But obviously that is quite an expensive thing to do. And I mean, Louise in particular referred to working for smaller organizations who won't have the budget for that. So I don't, Louise, could you talk a bit about, yeah, how you kind of try and think through that conversation? And
yeah, I mean, I think like James said, you know, it all comes, that sort of thing should be set at the beginning, really. So when you're thinking about what the objectives are, always have a mind of, well, how will you measure that? How will you see if that's what you've done? So yeah, just raising awareness is very difficult unless you're just going to, yeah, unless you've got a huge budget to do sort of polling before and afterwards on a big scale to check what awareness is. So we would measure things like the amount of coverage we have with target outlets, so making sure we're actually reaching people we want to reach. Perhaps how many clicks we have on the website. So if we've linked to a fundraising website, we could also then say, and did we have an increase in fundraising? I mean, that would be a very, very key piece of evaluation. Or links to a, if you're trying to raise awareness of symptoms, for example, and you've got a website page set up for that, it'd be great to sort of measure how many people went and visited it, how many people share, how many impressions you have on social media, how many people are using the hashtags. So those sort of things are all really useful, particularly if you're going to do this year on year, because you can measure how well you've done and how different tactics work across the year. So and then also measure anything negative as well. So if you get negative comments, make sure you include that. And just actually talking about International Women's Day, I do remember, I think it was last year. So this is a really important point, that make sure if you are going to jump on the hashtag or a day of something else, make sure that's something that your organization lives and values, because there were a lot of organizations last International Women's Day saying that they were supporting it, and then someone took to Twitter and looked at all the salaries of those organizations and just wrote underneath, this is how much more men are paid in your organization than women. And they did that across loads of different organizations, and it was retweeted and it went viral. It was huge, and it was even talked about on Women's Hour. So it can really backfire on you if you just jump on something that you can't, you know, say, actually, yes, this is something we truly believe in. So yeah, record your negative, anything negative you have as well, so that you can think about that when you're planning the next year.
I think maybe there's a role there almost for people to think about how could your organization essentially scupper other people's awareness days activities with those very relevant criticisms. And the gender pay gap bot was you know, so eye-catching. James.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's absolutely right. And I would use those examples. If you're in doubt and you think, I'm really not sure about this, but it's difficult to push back because this has come from the top, use these examples. Don't be afraid to use these examples of this is what could happen. Because at the end of the day, those kind of, let's look at Centre Parks this week. I can imagine at the very top, they'd rather have just not done anything done what they've done and be where they are now. And I think it's the same with a lot of these awareness days, weeks and months, is if you were to use those examples and say this is what could happen, that threat of bad news may well, it clearly outweighs the benefits of just the odd tweet here and there because we feel we have to. So do use that. There's loads of evidence out there that you should use to help in terms of if you feel not necessarily pushing back, but can I just double check? There are some considerations, there are some risks. These are the considerations I've identified. I think that's really important. And that example of the gender pay gap one was prolific, wasn't it? A really, really good one.
Yeah. And I think actually in terms of, Louise, there was something you mentioned earlier about, there will be negativity often around activities you do, and make sure you respond to that and learn from that. Although I suppose I'd add to that, don't feel you have to respond to absolutely everyone on Twitter, and think through what your kind of responsive strategy is. Don't think you're advocating replying to absolutely every single tweet an organization gets. But yes, it can get, it's also quite upsetting if you've as a PR person, you spent ages running a wonderful campaign and then someone uninformed has something negative to say about it and start shouting all over social media, and that's will happen.
And of course that could happen at a media level as well. You could have a journalist saying something negative. If you have a day that's focusing on helping people who have obesity, for example, you could have a journalist writing something really negative saying, well, it's their fault. You get all this sort of stuff with a lot of health campaigns, and you need to respond to it really robustly. So that's why I think you need to be quite reactive, and maybe think about that before the campaign launches. Think, okay, is there anyone out there that we know might say something negative about our day, or try and belittle it, or try and say that it's not important, and maybe have the lines ready for that in case it does happen.
A question's come in from Nick, who's asked, aside from fundraising, what kind of practical objectives can speakers point to as having been met as part of the campaign, especially around public health, particular health conditions, etc.? James, I'm going to pick on you first this time.
Yeah, so I suppose it comes back to the impact measures. I suppose some of the best examples I can think of would be policy change. So this is where, in some instances where we thought policy needs to change around this, maybe it's around nice guidance for certain meds, for instance, or something like that. And if you look at, I would quite often look at the legislative calendar and see what are the priorities in terms of where might this be being discussed, debated, and decisions made on it, whether that's in Parliament or whether it's through NICE looking at things or something. Have a look at that entire landscape and see what's going on. And you could launch something around then, like your own awareness day, to mark the day that someone's making a decision about that. So I think policy change is a really, really big one. I think we've worked with charities before, I think it was around Batten disease, where funding is so low. NICE guidance is not favourable because of the expense, because we have an NHS, which in terms of value, it's publicly funded, so things need to be valuable in terms of the pound spent per pound gained. And what it sees is patients having to and their parents having to drum up lots and lots of money to fly across the other side of the world to get the treatment that they need, because it's not funded to take place here. And if you can change that policy, then wow, how many people's lives is that going to change? So it's not just about fundraising. I'd say policy change for me would be a really, really big one. Change on funding decisions more broadly, which is obviously different to fundraising. That would probably be my biggest example. I'll have to think of some others as well.
And I mean, Louise, obviously you had pictures of some politicians that you'd met or your colleagues had met.
Yeah.
How did those conversations go?
So that's really good, actually. It's a good way of kind of getting their engagement and support for future campaigns. And also, I think on the back of the I think it was the melanoma focus one, we managed to get sort of a question in Parliament for the day as well. So that was really useful. So yeah, there's definitely political, because if you're getting attention in the media, then it's obviously of interest to the politicians as well. But also, I think it's quite a good way to engage with stakeholders. So it could be a way of recruiting case studies for future campaigns, or if you've got another wider campaign that's coming up, for the year. You might want people to sign a petition that's going to be part of that, or to sign up to be a member. And it's just a good way of saying, oh, can you visit our website and to support us? And there could be all these asks there. So there's quite a few different things that you can do to sort of increase people's engagement in your objectives.
And it's, go on, James.
To say, I've thought of two more. Just having that pause, I've thought of two more that we've done. One again is linked to policy change. So for Ocean Conservation Charity, we launched. There's a major problem about overfishing in UK waters, and that's been made worse by Brexit. Brexit has some quite tight regulations on how fishing is done in its waters. Now that we've left, we've got our own regulations, and those regulations are literally plundering the ocean floor around the United Kingdom, and in a bad way. And so we launched sort of Stop End Overfishing Day, and we launched it literally, I think, the day before the UK fishing regulations were being done in Parliament. And we launched it by doing a big stunt outside Parliament, where we beamed on a load of images onto the Palace of Westminster. So we were able to then get some traction on the back of that. This was literally the house it was being debated in the following day. So that worked quite well. And that objective of trying to shape the debate in advance was one. But again, it's the same example. It's linked to policy change. The other one was in some work we did on World Obesity Day. We were the theme was to end stigma around obesity, because if you look at media articles around the world, for instance, about obesity, you will tend to see the similar images used to try and represent obesity. It'll be a person living with overweight who might be eating a certain type of food, and it just really reinforces certain stereotypes around obesity that is not healthy, makes the problem worse. And so we did a big campaign to try and end stigma, and I couldn't believe it, because of all the newspapers it got on the front page, or it got on the front page of the Sun, which I didn't expect. So that was really good. But what we were trying to do is to try and encourage media to change the images that they were using in association with their articles. We weren't asking them to change their articles or what they're writing about. We weren't trying to affect the editorial policy in that respect. But we were trying to say, why do you have to use those kinds of images? That is stigmatizing. And then what we did is we launched this image bank of much more appropriate images that could be used by media. It's essentially a toolkit for media to say, look, you're using images that are really bad. These are the ones you can use, and go ahead and do them. And then what we did then after that is measure the use of those images in certain key media that we targeted. So I guess that's another example that's non-fundraising, but a way that we tried to really generate change. And the end result is that if those images are used more widely, then that will benefit people who are living with obesity, and because of that, and because of the stigmatism, all sorts of other health conditions can get in the way as well.
The image point, someone in the chat has mentioned that they've used that image. I know there's also the Centre for Aging Better has pictures of older people who not in their sort of stereotypical, sort of, gloomy and sort of disempowered settings. And I know there's also questions around this if you're a charity involved in mental health or suicide. So I think think really hard. And this probably especially goes if you're slightly more in that mode of, here's a day that we know is important, we want to post something and show our support. Don't just rush to the first image that you've found. Think about what that image actually communicates. Well, actually, there's a couple of questions which from Jean and from Patrick, I might just interrogate a little bit more and wonder if you can perhaps want to put a bit more. So, Jean has asked, do you have any recommendations for guides/resources on discussing sensitive topics? I've found that advice and resources online differ considerably. I wonder, Jean, if there's a particular topic you've got in mind. I suppose one answer to that would be something that James in particular spoke about earlier, which is making sure you're speaking to people with lived experience and understanding what matters to them, not making assumptions. And also Patrick's asked a point about the UN and World Health Organization coordinating a number of official awareness days, whether we have any experience of working with these. And well, I'm sure these days are obviously prominent in the calendar, and we will do have some experience. I don't know, Patrick, if you want to delve into that. But yeah, on that point, actually, when you're thinking about all these awareness days, do look at the UN and do look at World Health Organizations, and that will kind of give you a sense about sort of the credibility of some of them.
Yeah, I think from just on that, World Cancer Day is a really big day for a couple of my clients. So that is, yeah, that's obviously a global day that we get involved in. And again, it's an example of something where there's a lot of noise. So that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try and get news coverage, because we've been really successful several times in getting coverage for our stories. What it does mean is you just need to come up with something unique, very newsworthy, perhaps using new data, new research to make sure that your story gets cut through. So it can be maybe a bit more challenging, but don't let that put you off.
I think actually Patrick's just put something in the chat that kind of says Patrick said, I suppose it's about aligning messaging and getting cut through, given they are quite crowded, exactly as Louise said, it is crowded. I wonder if there's maybe also a question to ask about if there's an organization who is seen to sort of own the awareness day, or be, you know, the one where it's directly relevant to them. Might you think about approaching them, working in partnership with them, offering one of your case studies or offering some of your insights or comments? It might mean that you've got a better chance of that being placed and that landing, or that reaching a wider audience, but it might mean that your message is a bit more diluted because you're then a bit of a secondary partner. Whereas if you went alone, perhaps you're not going to be, you know, get the pick up in the first place, even, but actually your message is still there, you know, sort of undiluted. James, it looked like you were about to.
Yeah, it's that David and Goliath example that I mentioned earlier, isn't it? I mean, if you're going up against, you know, the World Health Organization or the UN, you are going up against some big ones. So don't just think about how the story can get, the contents of the story itself will get cut through, but just think tactically about how you might beat them to it. You know, I mentioned, like, if it's around a week, or for example, try and get in on the weekend papers beforehand, or if the day is on a Monday or a Tuesday or something, try and get into the Sunday and say ahead of World whatever it is day, and then focus it really targeted in that way, but in advance, and then you might be able to beat the noise rather than cut through it.
Yeah, also just on that, those sort of, the World Health Organization will be doing global stories for international and national media. If you're a small organization, you might think about doing something like an event. Like if you're a small NHS trust and you want to do something on World Cancer Day, then why not? You know, do an event. It'd be really great for local media, really great for your stakeholders, and it links into what's happening on a global scale, but you don't have to be directly in competition. You can just be part of that day. So yeah, have a think about who you want to reach and what's realistic for you.
A question's come in which well, relates to, so if someone anonymously is asked the speaker's thoughts on so many organisations publicly expressing condolences for the Queen's death, do they think there is any reputational risk if they weren't directly affected by her death, or is it a mark of respect and can only be seen positively? So this is clearly a very different event in the news cycle, but I'd be interested in, perhaps can we come to Louise first? Also, yeah, what advice have you given to clients?
Yeah, I think I think it's like James said earlier, it can be, you know, that's one thing to sort of say, you know, we're very sad to hear this news and just leave it at that, or like have something like quite respectful put out there. But some organizations, I think it's really backfired on them. Like, so what's happened with Centre Parks is just a classic example of they've almost felt like they should do something, but they've completely not thought about how bad it could go, and it's really backfired. So really, I know everything's happened like in a little bit of a rush, but really think about the possible fallout from anything like that. And again, it's like, talking about you know, mental health and suicide, you know, I've worked for mental health trusts, mental health organizations as well. It's obviously really important when you're getting your messages out there to make sure you always have resources listed on there for people that need help. You may want to put sort of trigger warnings on content as well. So phone number, if you're struggling, you may want to list that Samaritan's phone number or where to go for more information, like, rather than just put something out, particularly if it's on social media, rather than put something out with no context and no advice for follow-up. Again, Black History Month as well, like, make sure you're practicing what you preach. Like, don't say you're being really supportive of Black History Month and then, you know, if it turns out that you're not paying your black employees as much as the white employees. I mean, it's just, you really need to be honest about what your organization stands for and whether you can really say that you're supporting it.
I think it's a really, really good question. And I think it's right to raise it, because from an Awareness Day, Awareness Week, Awareness Month point of view, I think everybody knows that the 8th of September 2023 is going to be a busy news agenda, because people will be reflecting on what's happened over the past week. And I think 8th of September for a lot of us will be a day that media will dedicate space and time to this topic for a number of years. So I think it's quite right to raise it. And that in itself presents opportunities to certain comms professionals out there who may have relevant stories. Do I think there is any reputational risk? Yes, I think there is. I think the answer is to be proportionate. And I think some of the examples that we've seen have not been proportionate. And I think those are the ones who've ended up scoring own goals. I think it's about, I think it goes back to your own organization's core values. A lot of those, I'm sure, would involve honesty, integrity, you know, being dignified. And if your honesty and it's not relevant, then fine, but stick to your values and don't divert from your values, because that is then suddenly when you're in some quite dangerous territory. In terms of looking at the question, I know that a number of different kind of organizations are mentioned. So government arm's length body, for instance. Now, government arm's length bodies, they will have to be expected to meet the requirements set out in the Cabinet Office guidance around Operation London Bridge. Those work with arm's length bodies, we kind of had a dress rehearsal with Operation Forth Bridge last year when the Duke of Edinburgh died. And I think the guidance has been pretty similar this year. And I think as arm's length bodies, I think always make sure the sponsor department that's funding you is happy with what you're doing. But definitely I would use that guidance really, really cautiously in terms of making sure that you're meeting it and not going off it. And I think if you're a government arm's length body, I think that's really important. But I think if you're a charity that's maybe supported by the royal family, it's an opportunity to tell your own story. And I think I would bring that back, going back to that principle I mentioned of relevance, tie it back to why you're talking about it and why you're recognizing that it's a sad moment for you and your charity, because you've got your own individual story to tell based on that support. So that would be my advice. I think it will be different for different organizations and different ways of doing it. I think the biggest question is for those organizations who've got absolutely no link whatsoever, and that's where I would go back to your organization's values and also your organization's audiences as well.
You mentioned the death of Prince Philip, and there's one good or rather bad example of an organisation's commemorations there, which was National Rail changing its website to a sort of what it saw as a respectful grayscale version, which meant that people simply couldn't read the train times, especially those with impaired visibility. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that, you know, I think if you...
So I work with an arm's length body rail organisation that has a very colourful website, and we had long discussions last week about turning it grayscale. And I must say, I pushed back quite a bit against it. I think, again, go back to, is it proportionate? And yes, that's an important point. Is it accessible? And I think that's a really, really interesting example. I think a lot of organizations out there have gone grayscale, or some of them have just turned their icons on social grayscale, but kept their websites as they are. I think it's a really, really interesting one. Yeah, we had the exact same conversation last week and stuck with the colorful version, partly because of we felt it was the right thing to do, but also partly time and resource. It's to suddenly grayscale the whole website that's then suddenly quite a lot to do. And when you do have to react to some of these things, there are also other considerations you've got to bear in mind. You know, is it appropriate to hold public events? This event, for instance, I know we've got a panel speaker who's not able to attend because of the guidance. Those kinds of organizations, if they had events planned, they'll have had to cancel them. Not only will they have had to cancel them, they'll have had to communicate the fact that they've cancelled them or postponed them. And that communications is really, really important to get right as well in terms of sensitivity, because some of these people may have been really, really keen for this event. They've waited a very long time for this event, and now it can't happen, and who knows when it next is going to happen. I think there's a lot to consider.
Yeah. Now thank you, Jean, for sort of bringing a bit more of your question out, which is around what guides there are around language that can be used or that should be used in particular areas around mental health / suicide, or discussing issues of race. And well, I'm sure we could think of a few examples. The Samaritans, I know, Mind have something around media talking about mental health. But I think it would I think, Jean, you're probably going in the right direction by asking if they are there, and look to different organisations who are relevant to the topic areas, and as I kind of pointed out earlier, speak to people who have lived experience of the issue involved. I wanted now, Louise says you mentioned work with World Menopause Day, and menopause is a topic that's been thanks to you and your colleagues, has been getting a lot more attention of late. And I suppose that that made me sort of wonder, what's that felt like in terms of there being a bit of a transition from maybe fighting for this attention to now it not necessarily being easy to come by.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because the first year we did it, the coverage we got was mainly generated around our news story that we put out, which was really great. We got really good global coverage. But now we're finding that stories are going out, even though it's the day that the International Menopause Society, it's their day, we're finding loads of other organisations are doing their own stories and their own their own sort of campaigns. And so Timpsons are now giving women days off if they need to, if they're feeling unwell with symptoms of menopause, and they get loads of coverage on the back of that, which is fantastic. There's been loads more documentaries, so it's not anything we have any control over, but it's still really, really good, because it's generally really positive, raising awareness of something that used to be completely taboo sort of 10 years ago. It's definitely, it's got bigger and bigger and bigger, but it's really interesting to be working for the organisation who actually created the day in the first place, because it's sort of like, it's their day. They own it in a way, but it's got much bigger than something they actually own. But we sort of continue to stick very much on a kind of new research, new science sort of angle of things. And then other organisations, if they want to do their own thing, then that's fantastic as well.
And I suppose you might then, you're not necessarily, clearly you don't have control over what they're saying on the day. No. And you might even see something that a non-partner organisation to put up. I think that's not quite accurate, especially in the medical context. It's probably good to then follow up with them a week later. We can either react to it, although we do actually notice that a lot of that it is almost self-moderating, that because there's so many clinicians and doctors engaged with it on social media that they will respond and say, actually, no, what you're saying isn't accurate, people should be doing this. And it's interesting because it's very different in different countries as well in terms of what healthcare is available. It's not something we've had to be particularly robust about inaccuracies, and actually we haven't really had many people being negative. Doesn't seem to be a subject that people get annoyed about the coverage around, or they don't feel that. I mean, you do occasionally get people saying there shouldn't be special allowances for women going through menopause, but that's not something the International Menopause Society is particularly calling for. They're just actually putting the science out there and saying this is the effect it can have on people. It's not been a major issue so far, but it's definitely something we keep an eye on the day and leading up to the day as well. I'm conscious we're coming up to 1 o'clock. I think both speakers are happy to stay on a little longer if there are any further questions, or just as we wrap up. So do get any last questions in.
Can I just jump in on one point just to build on what Louise said there? I think it's really important, and under the relevance point that I mentioned, principle that I mentioned in the slide earlier, there was a point that said the landscape, which was looking at who are the other players on the field. And I think Louise is absolutely right, is don't just look at what your organisation can do and say, but who else can go out there and do and say things that will help you meet your objective. And I haven't really mentioned Purple Tuesday much in this one, but that's a really good example that we do there, which is Purple as an organisation. It's a disability organisation, and it's trying to make other organisations be more accessible for disabled people. And I think what's really interesting about that is other organisations see it as their opportunity to demonstrate the work they're doing to be more accessible. So we work on a press release, we put it out to all our media weeks in advance. We have a good chat with them and line them all up. But then M&S the day before will put out a story saying that they are improving. I think there was an incident at Charing Cross store where there was a person with a guide dog and the security guard wouldn't let them in. And there were some really, really negative articles about that. So M&S quite rightly completely changed their policy, and they used Purple Tuesday as the platform to launch that. And that got loads and loads of coverage, which was great, because we were like, yes, we didn't secure it, but it's all about Purple Tuesday, and it's all about making important changes to make your store or your service or your organization more accessible. And so tapping into that kind of willingness for people to use your day is definitely something you should try and look into, because there's so much potential there.
Absolutely. Hermione has just put on the chat slightly kind of the Twitter account, which has a slightly sort of black humor approach, but also this gets across this point that, yeah, be careful with what you're doing in terms of jumping onto an external event, in particular the death of the Queen. That's yeah, a bit of amusing viewing, but also important. I've got an enormous list of questions that I haven't even managed to ask you, because I think there's so many kind of facets and niches and different areas to think about. But I think we will bring it to a close here. But as I said, we'll make sure we've got a write-up on the PRCA website, and I'm sure you two can be contacted over Twitter or via your company's website to carry on the discussion. Because yeah, I know I see from the comments people find it useful, which is great. Thank you so much again, everyone, for joining. Thank you, James, Louise, and the PRCA for facilitating. And yes, have a good afternoon.